Happy 2025, y'all, and welcome back. We got a big video in store for the first video of 2025, going through 15 top NHL players who I think will be traded in 2025. Now, this doesn't just include this season. This includes the offseason and the start of next year. Throughout the calendar of 2025, these are the biggest players that I see being dealt. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the trade rumors and all the trade rankings, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more ranking content just like this all throughout the year. And trust me, a lot of content's gonna be coming before the NHL trade deadline, so subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Now, getting us started with the top players that could be moved, we're gonna go into a guy who I could see being dealt at the deadline, I could see being dealt in the next month, I could see being dealt in the offseason, even the start of next year. There are so many possibilities with a potential JT Miller trade. It's been reported by basically everyone and their mother that there's been a rift between JT Miller and Elias Pettersson, and I think for the Canucks, if they're gonna choose one guy to move, it's likely to be Miller in the end. JT has a full no-move clause, but I could see the situation wearing thin and eventually a trade happening. If it were to, I think Miller would get a ton of value on the market. You can see that's just the production he's been able to put up these past few years, an 103-point season last year. Playoff numbers pretty great for Vancouver over the last couple of stretches. He's somebody that has been an insanely valuable offensive piece for this team, and something that Vancouver would hate to lose, but at the same time, it just feels inevitable at this point. We've already seen a lot of teams, Elliot Friedman mentioning Chicago, and especially the New York Rangers, I think should be in on Miller 110%. For Vancouver, they have a lot of leverage here still in this situation, and we'll see how it goes, but I think it'll be a really interesting one to keep an eye on. At the very least, though, I could absolutely see a first rounder, a solid player, and a top prospect going back for Miller. That type of package, I think, is pretty easily attainable by Vancouver. Now, moving on to the second player today to talk about, another player that's been rumors quite a bit the last month or so. It is Brandon Saad of the St. Louis Blues, who makes $4.5 million for this year and next. And this is why I was pretty confident putting him in the video. We've heard a lot about him potentially wanting out with St. Louis and potentially making a trade, but it's interesting because of his contract. I think it's probably more likely we see this deal in the offseason, just because for teams it would be a lot more easy to bring on a $4.5 million deal when it's just one more season left. But a two-time Stanley Cup winner, he's somebody that offensively still has his moments, but this year has struggled on a St. Louis team that's been all over the place. In 33 games, just 4 goals, 10 points, not the production that St. Louis or Saad wants. Even though his defensive play has slipped since his prime, Saad got 26 goals last year, and I think in the right system can get back to that type of production and be a very important piece for a potential contender. Now, moving on to number 3, and a younger player on the list here that I think could potentially get moved is Joel Farabee of the Philadelphia Flyers. Another player that we've heard as well in rumors, and somebody that I think really does need a change of scenery. 24 years old and a former 14th overall pick. He's someone that when he's at his best can be a great power forward. This year, though, it hasn't quite been up to that level. He's on pace for just 30 points, 14 points in 39 games so far, after having 50 points and 22 goals last season. Farabee is somebody that is frustrating. He could be inconsistent, but again, I think in the right system, he could provide quite a bit. Just hasn't quite been a complete fit under John Tortorella. But I think he's somebody that is extremely talented, is somebody that the Flyers would hate to lose, but I think at the same time, with just how inconsistent he's been and that cap hit as well at $5 million, I could see the Flyers getting rid of him, especially in the offseason. Especially if the Flyers want to take some steps next year and get even more competitive, I could see Farabee potentially part of a bigger deal to potentially end a center for the team, perhaps, that would maybe complement the roster better than Farabee is right now. Now, going on to another younger player here, this time on the defense, and from my favorite team, the Dallas Stars, I got Nils Lundkvist. Now, I have a lot of problems with the Stars defense, with just how bad experiments like Matt Dumba have gone. But I think Nils Lundkvist is going to be the fall man eventually and end up being dealt, especially with his lackluster ice time again this season and just 3 assists, 3 points in 29 games. I doubt that Nils Lundkvist is going to get too much of an opportunity going forward, and I still think the Stars are probably going to deal him while his value is even something at this point. I don't think it's too much, but I think you can still get something back, and I think for the Stars, there could potentially, especially this offseason, be a little bit of a retooling of that defense. I think Nils Lundkvist will be a part of that. This deadline, I could easily see the Stars potentially wanting to retool this defense as well and not waiting until the offseason. At least that's my hope, because there are some major issues with the D-core right now. Lundkvist, I think, is a pretty inoffensive part of that, but I could easily see him being the Grushnikov of the Tanev deal last year, where you trade a D to get a better D, and in the Stars case, I think that's something they should really be looking at. I mean, just look at the defense, man. You got Heiskanen, Lindell, and Harley on the left side, but Lyubushkin, Lundkvist, and Dumba Tampa on the right. I would sacrifice my eldest child for the Stars to get a D replacement on the right side because it is badly needed. Now we go on to an older Swedish defenseman, but a much more consistent and proven one in Marcus Pettersson, who is another player on this Penguins team that is in flux. Especially a couple months ago, it seemed like it was going to happen imminently that we were going to see a Marcus Pettersson trade. I still think most likely we will see one, though with Pittsburgh's competitiveness over the last month, it's kind of a wait and see. I don't think it's out of the question, though, for the Penguins to still trade Pettersson and still try to go for a playoff push. At least that's what is something I would try if I was them. He's somebody that has had some very reliable results, especially last year, where I thought he was absolutely brilliant. 30 points in 82 games, and defensively his best season yet. He's somebody that as a two-way defenseman would be incredibly valuable out there. I think could easily get a first-round pick for the Penguins back, and it's something I think that they should ultimately be looking at. We'll see if they actually do it in the end, but if this Pittsburgh team wants to bolster that young crop coming up, Pettersson, I think, could be a really big part in doing so. Now, another player that I could see going out of Pittsburgh, but for not as much value as Pettersson, is Tristan Jarry. And I hate to say it, but it just hasn't worked out whatsoever. When the contract was signed, that huge extension, $5.375 million, I thought it was an absolute disaster, and so far it has been. Health issues have again plagued Jarry, and even when he has been healthy, he hasn't been all that great. You see in 17 games this year, an .885 save percentage. Just bad, just poor performances, time in and time out. You've had Nedeljkovic come in, you've had Lundkvist come in and put up some great starts here and there, but in Jarry's case, it's few and far between. He's 29 years old, and yes, I know injuries have played a massive part, but for this Penguins team that needs every single bit of cap space they can get, Jarry taking that much up is just unacceptable. I don't think he has much value out there because of that cap hit, but I think they have to find a way to make a deal work. Especially by next season, at least with what Joel Blomqvist has shown, I think you could go in a position where he is your starter next season, at least with another full season of pro hockey under his belt. I could absolutely see him being up to that task. At least I would give him the chance before I go another season, hoping that Jarry gets back to form when it's probably never going to happen. I'd love to be wrong on this because Jarry is a great person from what I can tell, but man, it is just, the writing's on the wall. And I think for Pittsburgh, especially for an offseason trade, this is something that I think should be a priority. Next up, we move on to number 7, and the 7th player that I could see being dealt in 2025. This one is a pretty obvious one in Trent Frederic. This is a player that we talked a lot about over the last couple months. It seems like all throughout the start of the season has been on the trade block. You can see just a bad season to talk about. After a 40-point year last season, in 40 games, he's on pace for 22 and about half the goals scored as well. Just an ineffective player for the Bruins so far this year, and it's been sour, I think, this situation, because he has been such a productive player in the past and such a versatile guy, but the speed has been a weakness this year. The lack of opportunistic play has really plagued him this season too, and I think this is somebody that has a lot of potential to be more of a power forward, to assert himself more, but just hasn't been doing so this year. I still think can be a really effective middle six player in the right system, but I just don't think Boston is the place where he's going to unlock that whatsoever. He's already had a coaching change, hasn't looked much better under that. I think it's just a situation that Boston needs to get rid of. But considering his low cap hit at $2.3 million, I don't think he's going to be extremely hard to move whatsoever. I still think his value is pretty high across the league, especially for what he can be, which I think is an effective player. But in Boston, I just don't think it's going to happen. Now we go into Minnesota, and a player situation that I don't see a lot of people talking about, but something that I can especially see in the offseason potentially getting dealt with. Let's go into the Minnesota Wild and Ryan Hartman. And this is one that I think is interesting because we've seen Marco Rossi, of course, come in and fill that first-line center role, which was previously held by Hartman between Zuccarello and Kaprizov in the past, and he was really good at benefiting from those two players. But we can see now that Rossi has taken that role, the production decrease. You go from 45 points, 21 goals last year, to just 10 points on a pace for 22 points this season. Hartman's play has fallen off a cliff, and I could easily see Minnesota getting rid of him. The only thing that could hold a trade back, in my opinion, is that contract. He makes $4 billion for not just this year and next, but for the next 2 seasons after this season. And he also has a no-move clause as of right now. So I don't think there's going to be a trade within this year. I think at the very least it will probably happen at the start of next season. Once his 15-no trade list comes into count, you could actually have an opportunity to trade Hartman to other places. And I think he would still have value as a versatile middle sixer, but just not the perfect piece that Minnesota needs right now. I think you can get an upgrade on him, and considering his lack of production this year, I think next year we could see them making a change. Next up at number 9, let's go on to the New York Rangers and their defense, a team that is going to have a lot of changes over the next year. To me, one of the critical pieces that will get dealt, though, absolutely, to me, is K'Andre Miller. He's somebody that this year has just been poor in a lot of key areas. There's been a lot of times where he kind of looks flustered out there. It looks like he has no idea where he is positionally, and that is a far cry from what we've seen in the past. I think K'Andre Miller has been a very effective and underrated puck mover as well for the Rangers, especially these last couple of seasons, but this year has just not been on that level, and I think for him especially, he's someone that can benefit from a change of scenery to a place that has a little less pressure, because honestly, for how young he is, I think he can be a very effective overall two-way defenseman. The size is there, some of that hitting ability is there, and the puck movement I think has been there in the past. I think they'll provide a lot of value, especially with that cap hit being extremely low at $3.8 million. I think he's somebody that has a lot of value around the league, and if the Rangers were going to change up that defense, he would probably be the biggest priority. Ryan Lindgren was also somebody I considered, but I think considering the value that Miller has, I think he'll get more interest out there. It is a shame because I think he was looking solid for this Rangers defense. It was looking like a core part of the future, but just like a lot of other players on this Rangers team, it feels like this year will be his last. Now we go into a pair of Seattle Kraken forwards and two guys that I could absolutely see being dealt. We're going to start out here at number 10 and go on to Yanni Gourde, somebody that we've talked about a little bit as well before, but somebody that I think can fill a really interesting role for a lot of teams out there. A more defensive presence that, of course, has had so much playoff success over the years. The Stanley Cups in Tampa Bay and just the consistency. Even with Seattle, he's put up some good numbers, 13 points in 14 games in his Seattle playoff appearance. You can see this year production hasn't quite been there. It really hasn't quite been there the last couple of seasons. More filling into that veteran experienced role in a bottom six. But I think for Seattle, he's somebody that has seen his ice time decrease, and I think for good reason. He's at 33 years old, not the best in his prime anymore, but I think can be a really versatile bottom six player for a lot of playoff teams that need that consistent playoff performance. Yanni Gourde is about as consistent of a playoff performer as you can get. I think considering how up and down Seattle's season has been, the lack of chances I think they're going to make the playoffs, I think Gourde is an easy player to move and somebody that, quite frankly, they should. I think if Seattle is looking to improve that future, I think Gourde would do a pretty good job at helping that. Especially for Seattle opening up that center position, potentially for a player like Berkeley Catton to come in next year, I think could be interesting. We'll see if that actually ends up happening, but Seattle has options with Gourde, and we'll see if they go far with it. But that's not the only Seattle forward I wanted to talk about, because next up I'm going to go to another one in Andre Burakovsky, who is somebody that has just not really worked out for Seattle since signing there as a free agent. Of course, won his Stanley Cup with Colorado, but since then hasn't really been quite the same player, and especially with his health, it just hasn't been there. This year, he seems to be a lot more healthy, which is good to see, but the production just hasn't really been all that inspiring. In 36 games, his 3 goals, 12 assists, 15 points. Really, that speed and that intensity and the skill level that Burakovsky once had hasn't really been showcased in Seattle, and I could easily see the Kraken getting rid of him to try and retool that top six a little bit. The Burakovsky experiment just has not been working, and I think for him, honestly, a change of scenery will be good. He's another player that I could see the contract getting in the way, though. He makes $5.5 million for the next 2 seasons after this year and has a 10-team no-trade list, so you do have a little bit of restrictions in trying to get a deal done. But I think in the offseason, when teams are a lot more likely to bring on higher cap hits, Burakovsky could be dealt. And I think if he gets back to his great production with Colorado, is an effective player, no doubt, with the offense he can provide. I just think in Seattle, it hasn't quite been the fit they envisioned. Now we're going to go on to another winger in the Pacific Division that I could see being dealt. Let's go on to the Anaheim Ducks, and let's go on to Frank Vatrano, who I think is a pretty easy player to see being dealt at this year's deadline. He's somebody that wasn't dealt, I think, mostly because of the term left on his deal last year, but now he is a rental, and I think it's a pretty solid one. Sure, the production hasn't been otherworldly like we saw last year. 37 goals in 82 games was just ridiculous, and that was never going to sustain itself. But this year, 20 points in 36 games, a 40, 50-point player. I think that's what Frank Vatrano can be. And if you have that type of guy to the playoffs, I think that is an effective player. I mean, for the Rangers, he didn't solve all their problems back in 2022, but he got 13 points in 20 games, 5 goals. Not bad production for a rental. He's somebody that I think can be up to that level, can be a solid middle six contributor, a solid power play force. That goal scoring, I think, is going to get better as the shooting percentage gets back to that solid level. We'll see what happens with Vatrano, but I think especially considering what he was able to do last year, I think his value is still fairly high. And I think also of what Pat Verbeek likes, I doubt that Vatrano is going to be somebody that Anaheim looks to re-sign. He's more of a skill-based forward, and considering how much grit Anaheim's tried to add, I doubt that Vetrano is really a part of those future plans all that much. I think could get a decent bit back for the Ducks and likely add to their draft capital this year. Now going on to the Winnipeg Jets, and I don't see many major changes happening to this team, but I do see the defense changing a little bit after this season. One player that I do see being dealt, though, is finally Ville Heinola, who I just kind of feel bad for because he's never really gotten that great opportunity in Winnipeg that I think he could have gotten on other teams. Now, he is still fairly young at 23 years old, but a former 20th overall pick, 6 foot, 181 pounds, has proved to be a solid puck mover in his time with the Manitoba Moose. You can see just the production there last year, 27 points in 41 games. The year before that, 37 points in 48 games. I think this is somebody that can be a useful, versatile offensive defenseman, or at least somebody that you should give more of an opportunity to. The Jets just haven't been able to do that because that defense has been so locked in. But I think in Heinola's case, he's somebody that is worth getting a tryout for. I mean, if Justin Barron can get a player like Alexander Carrier back, I think Heinola can get some value out there, and hopefully so, because I think he deserves a fresh situation to play in, and I just don't think the Jets going to give him the opportunity that they give to players like Logan Stanley for some reason. I don't think he's going to be this elite talent or this power play one quarterback, but I think he can be useful offensive defenseman, and for a lot of teams out there down in the dumpster, why not try a guy like this out who has had great production still at the North American level, but has yet to prove himself in the NHL? We'll see. Now going on to another Central Division player that has had a really tough time as of late. We go on to Philipp Kurashev, somebody that I think for Chicago is a very easy player to trade, and honestly somebody that they should. Making $2.25 million, he has just not been it. He hasn't been playing with Connor Bedard much of this season, which is why you've seen a massive decrease in his point production. In terms of just the pace, he's going to go from 54 points last year to 12, which is an extraordinarily bad fall off. It's kind of incredible just how bad that is. A lot of it has been due to luck, but just because of the deployment as well, not quite being there, we've seen Kurashev's points decrease. But I think he can still be a versatile player, somebody that can bring some good skill and tight, and I think he's somebody that you could place potentially in your middle six and get something out of. But in Chicago this year, it's just been a mess in a lot of different situations. Kurashev, though, especially, has just been a mess in a lot of ways. But I think a lot of it is mental. I think a lot of it has just been the demotion, the decrease in his playing time that has led to a lot of unfortunate statistics. I think in his case, though, still at 25 years old, this is somebody that I think can be an NHLer, and I hope gets a shot somewhere else. Now we go on to number 15 and go on to somebody that I could absolutely see being dealt. A pretty interesting one that I don't see a lot of people talking about, and that is Josh Norris. Now, Ottawa is going to be interesting over the next year to see how they kind of retool this roster. They've been solid as of late. They're in a wild card spot, so we'll see how that goes. But I think Josh Norris has been maybe one of the more frustrating ones on this team. Somebody that has gotten a little bit healthier this season, and that is great to see. 37 games, 14 goals, 22 points. But defensively has had his rough moments this year, and he's more of a power play sniper, more of somebody that is needing the right players around him to feed the puck to have sustainable success. And I think that's something that for Ottawa, they have had difficulty finding around him. I think he's more of a one-dimensional player and hasn't really grown from that. And I think that's something that could frustrate Ottawa as they look to make bigger pushes potentially in the playoffs. I think you could potentially see Ottawa getting rid of Norris for maybe a second-line center, or potentially adding on to that four group, maybe having Shane Pinto added on as the second-line center for next season. We'll see how they go through it. But I mean, considering his cap hit and just how kind of inconsistent he's been for the Senators, I could see them getting rid of him. Considering his injury history, though, I'm not sure how much value there is for a player making that type of money on that type of term, but he has been better this year, has been healthier, has been still scoring a decent amount of goals, so we'll see what ends up happening. But in Norris's case, I would not be surprised if an offseason move happens as Ottawa makes major changes to that group. But those are my 15 players that I could see being dealt over the next calendar year. And let me know your comments down below on everybody we mentioned today, on which players you agree and disagree potentially getting dealt. And I want to know down below, what player is a surprising one that you could see being dealt over the next calendar year? Let me know all your thoughts down below. And of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online to get the trade rumors out there. And click on this card for all of my trade content right on one playlist there, free to binge. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and let's have a great 2025 Grav gang, and have a great one. Goodbye.